Great. Thanks ever so much. Thanks so much for letting me talk to you guys today. My name's McLaughlin. I just started a new job yesterday as an open research librarian at the University of West London. But this time last week, I was very happy to be a sales and marketing consultant at PTFS Europe. And I was meant to join today in person for the conference, but unfortunately, my leave time was just at the worst possible, most kind of PTFS Europe group holiday missing time. So I'm very disappointed, but really delighted to get to talk to you virtually instead. Um, so BTFS Europe gave me a really big love of all things open source and was truly kind of my introduction into open source software and being still fairly new to the overall library world. But I'm really passionate about the open library movement more broadly. And so my presentation today takes a bit of a holistic look at open concepts in the digital library world and how we need buy-in for the overall philosophy of openness as library and information professionals, but especially as open source software enthusiasts. So again, it takes quite a broad look. It's quite philosophical. So I'm really keen to just seed kind of some ideas and some conversations just about the ways in which kind of we're losing ground or have been in terms of open concepts and libraries, and really the kind of messages that we need to be sending out and interconnected kind of issues that we as people vested in open movements need to be concerned with. That's about me. So, just as a bit of an introduction, one of the key things that I really want to get at through the course of this talk is that the best social infrastructure is shaped by activism. We know that by people that are passionate, that are motivated, maybe a little bit angry, and often that's quite justified with a system that's broken. I want to talk about how our online infrastructure has been and continues to be heavily manipulated by Silicon Valley and how that's really affected our understanding of digital public spaces and online library services. And this is like quite intertwined, actually. I want to encourage you to think more broadly about openness in our digital public spaces and the end goal of putting the power back into communities. And I truly believe that open source software libraries or Koha libraries can be at the fore of achieving this. The technological architecture is community and not profit orientated by design. And that is both beautiful and important. So big, powerful guys are constantly reminding us that social media is something like a kind of new public square. Elon Musk said it, so is Mark Zuckerberg. Even our Supreme Court justices in the US ruled that access to this online public square is protected under the First Amendment, the right to free speech. But taking a wider purview, if we think of our online lives as corresponding with our actual kind of corporeal lives and the physical locations that we frequent, we can start thinking more deliberately about the kind of digital public spaces that we have been and continue to build as we move from our kind of Web 2 to our Web 3 era. Eli Paris, our co-director of New Public, which is an online community that is really dedicated to setting us up with healthier online public spaces for the future, liken the design and building process to how we set up our modern cities. Stating unequivocally that cities are some of the best source of some of our best ideas. And he continued speaking on how we create thriving digital communities, saying sometimes it feels like this whole project of wiring up a civilization and getting billions of people to come into contact with each other is just impossible. But modern cities tell us that it's possible for millions of people who are really different, sometimes living right on top of each other, not just to not kill each other, but to actually build things together, find new experiences, create beautiful and important infrastructure. And we cannot give up on that promise. And indeed, that quotation has provided an excellent soundbite for the title of this talk. But also, how can you not hear this amongst you and not think open source, building things, finding new experiences, and making things better for all? However, Pariser's vision is but a utopian kind of idea of city living. It's the best possible imagining. We know that in reality, many of our major kind of European cities suffer from issues like deeply entrenched racism, inequality, long term deprivation. Many people wouldn't want to spend time there. And that's become increasingly true of our online spaces also. Despite its undeniable value, technology is exacerbating deep social and political divisions in many societies. Got elections influenced by fake news and unscrupulous hidden actors, cyber hacking of trusted national institutions, the vacuuming of private information by Silicon Valley behemoths, and ongoing threats to vital infrastructure from terrorist groups and even other foreign governments. All these concerns are just part of the daily news churn and are certain to become increasingly serious into the future. Our best social infrastructure is continuously sustained and shaped by activism and engagement. What's the most excellent example of this that we could draw on? Why, of course, it's libraries. You only have to think about Andrew Carnegie's library building system and how motivated women were often the secret weapon for getting library grants in communities across the US. Women's clubs often built support for public libraries and raised money to sustain them. And women also showed up to work as librarians in droves. These were people who were passionate about their communities and their betterment and felt empowered enough to group together and bring about the changes that they wanted to see. Of course, our online social infrastructure, what we've accepted as our digital public square, being social media, obviously it has its benefits. But I don't need to go over how great it is that we can keep in touch with all of our friends all over the world, etc., etc. The pros are really self-evident. But these platforms have always been ruled by like malign corporate interests above all else and are largely sustained by users' passivity, their disengagement from all but scrolling endlessly. Online library users are more densely populated than ever. So how do we make sure that the online spaces that they inhabit are positive, kind, and empowering, a counterbalance to that Silicon Valley mob-ruled public square? Well, firstly, the underlying architecture has to be constructed with technology that's interoperable and responsive. It has to, bottom line, be open. Publicly funded libraries are part of a community's intellectual commons, and open source software extends that intellectual commons into the realm of computer software, thereby preventing that tight control over information that comes from controlling the software that makes the content accessible. And we want to think of our libraries as a place of online collection and not just digital collection. We know here well that the technological foundation of open source software was built around the ability of the internet to serve as a means of instant and ubiquitous communication. And it's a workflow that speaks to the immediacy of the digital environment. Moreover, the expectations that people have of online spaces, which are largely to date shaped by their experiences of commercial platforms. But we only need to look at the app formerly known as Twitter, currently known as X. We see how a severe case of megalomania can destroy a formerly populous, bustling online space. Open source software provides the base for technology that's participative and continuous in its improvement, and that's that model that we really want to kind of get across is open in its very kind of design and also needs to kind of usher in that same kind of purview of being open in a localized context that's inherently community minded. That's powerful. So consider how open access has gone from being once a really provocative idea to a mainstream concept over the past 20 years. It's not just a given feature of the scholarly landscape, a normal part of the research life cycle that was created in response to the serial crisis long ago. Now we need to think more about the ownership crisis and redress kind of excessive control over information. Libraries have already been pushing for more openness in their worlds over the past 2 decades, and even more so in recent years. Got open access to journal articles, open library data, e.g., the work that Libraries Hack does here in the UK, free open books via Project Gutenberg, the Open Library, open repositories for sharing research data, open access to digital archives to facilitate, your local history, family research, libraries, events, the open source software commitment to unrestricted exchange of information and ideas, transparency and public accountability as well. The importance of these open principles can't be overstated when thinking about the next digital age on how we want to shape our online public spaces for the good of library users and indeed everyone. We know that the open source community we're all part of is just such a hotbed of collaboration and innovation that can far better respond to the changing technological climate. I know how great is the culture of competitive sharing that we'll take part in. It just improves the software that we're working with for the benefit of ourselves, our libraries, and their patrons. We've got the means to transform our libraries ourselves, and it's a way of working that empowers basically anyone to innovate with the added bonus of the earnest support of a global network of excellent developers. The global aspect is also key. Developing our digital public spaces shouldn't have to come at the cost of real world communities. Like any precious resource, digital technology has growth limits, not as abundant and cheap as we've been previously led to believe. And the true cost is seen in communities and ecosystems that are already suffering across the globe. Like the push for ever more data is causing communities in Chile to have insufficient water for growing crops. Instead, data centers are sucking it all up, using far more than their fair share. We want to offset the dominant values that perpetuate these systems of inequality that have been so harmful to our planet, namely the kind of short-term growth and extraction of profit above all else. It's so important to communicate how open libraries, open source software, all these kind of concepts, they allow us to prioritize kind of technology's application to the things that really matter. Libraries as a force for good need to be part of that wider picture that reduces the harm and inequality that digital technology has wrought in a culture of excessive growth. We all want to enjoy the benefits of digital technology, but sustainably and for the long term. The actual physical world needs to be part of our bigger picture kind of envisionings and questions and imaginings. When we're thinking about how to build healthy, flourishing digital public spaces through online library services, platforms that aren't kind of dogged by the worst impulses of today's internet, platforms that instead just channel the best facets of online life in a sustainable and constructive way. We've got to build our kind of palaces for the people, to be more thoughtful about why and how people gather online, reimagine models that go beyond just ad-supported social media, and apply what we know about well-designed open software that facilitates community engagement in this digital sphere. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about issues around ownership and access, because truly if we want to lean into this kind of metaphor that I touched on at the beginning of this talk about imagining our online platforms as city and public spaces, one of the most obvious parallels is with kind of issues around access and ownership. Like most young people, I live in a city and I spend a lot of money on rent. I also spent a lot of money on like subscriptions to various entertainment platforms, namely Netflix. So I'm going to talk about as my kind of de facto example of one of these kind of content landlords. And they want you to force you to pay rent instead of being able to own, so to speak. Because it makes them more money, and if you can't pay, they'll boot you out. There's no sense of community or fellowship here with these types of organizations. So we know that when you buy a book, you own it, you pay for it, and after you're done reading it, it's yours to sell. You could use it in an art project, donate it, or lend it to friends. That's how it's always worked. It's your business. Now millions are being spent to kind of change the rules and convince the public that it works differently. Many content landlords, like Netflix, don't like the idea of customers owning their own homes because it means that you could Airbnb your home, for example, or sell your house once you're ready to move. And that's bad news for content landlords, like, again, Netflix being the prime example, because every house that you resell is one that Netflix doesn't get to sell on. So instead of buying and owning content, these content landlords prefer that we pay subscriptions, i.e., we pay over and over without ever actually getting to own the content, and to eliminate our purchase option entirely. Without it, renting becomes the only option, and so they're free to arbitrarily hike up rental fees, which we have to pay over and over again without getting any of these aforementioned rights and freedoms. You get less for more. And then, you also have to consider what happens if one of these content landlords like Netflix goes out of business. Your subscription library just disappears into the ether with them forever. And this can and indeed has happened before. Does anybody remember Microsoft Books, which we've lost to the ages and all the content therein? The end of forever access has other serious consequences as well. Content such as ebooks are only ever offered for lease and are never actually owned, and the only way to lease a book is using digital rights management. How can it ever get to the point where it enters our public domain? How can it ever be part of the intellectual commons? Netflix would need to ensure that a content remains available for 100 years, and good luck with that. They swap things out month to month. They only do this if it makes them money, so we'd need to keep renting it to ensure its popularity for the duration of this 100-year period, which is an expensive proposition. Even after this, in order for the content to enter the public domain, Netflix would have to release an digital rights managed version, and why would they? Otherwise, someone would have to risk breaking digital rights management, which appears to be unto itself illegal, irrespective of whether the underlying content is public domain. So in practice, a lease-only ebook model seems to spell the end of the public domain by essentially making the public domain illegal or impossible by default. These kind of subscription-only models just rob patrons of autonomy, of ownerships, of rights, artistic and creative license. For example, platforms shouldn't get to decide how I use my movies, music, or track me while I'm watching, or track what I'm watching, sell your data, or limit what tools you might use to consume content. But it's something that we're increasingly just accepting as part and parcel of this content renting model. Now, to take a more kind of library view of this, leasing to lend, by preventing libraries from owning digital materials and from making their physical materials digital, by forcing a lease model that requires libraries to purchase materials yearly, and by increasing the cost of leasing, content landlords are extorting libraries, diminishing their, i.e. our public kind of funded libraries, purchasing power such that libraries can afford to release fewer books each year. They prevented from making millions of books accessible to the public, forcing libraries to prioritize kind of things that are popular and cost effective at the expense of thousands of culturally significant materials, which may only be applicable to a very select audience. In short, content landlords are stressing hundreds of libraries financially to the verge of being unable to accomplish their mission of equitable access, and could lead to the possible eventual collapse. Overdrive in Libby, run by the Japanese for-profit Rakuten, exploits this vulnerability and fills the digital divide for libraries by negotiating ebook access through publishers. So titles are made available indeed to libraries, but at a significant markup. You see it sometimes going for like 5 times what it costs you to buy off Amazon. If this weren't bad enough for libraries, Overdrive pushes libraries in the direction of foregoing that first sale doctrine, so that instead they get a watered down lease model where the library has to pay over and over again to lease and lend books. So the libraries, which we fund again as taxpayers, spend 5 times the cost of a book that you'd maybe see on Amazon, and then at the end of it only get a 2-year lease before the purchase has to be renewed. What's the alternative for libraries not having the digital books that patrons want? For the past 10 years, just to give you an idea, 90% of libraries in America have relied on Overdrive to provide that digital offering. we fast forward like another decade, say if we're starting to imagine like 2033, when libraries have been spending taxpayer money on leasing, hemorrhaging it for year on year, but no longer owning the books that they purchase. What happens again if one of these ebook providers stops doing business or increases their rates? It's just not a sustainable model. Again, I refer you back to the gone and almost entirely forgotten Microsoft books. This can happen. Once upon a time, libraries just simply paid for the books once. By doing so, decades later, they eventually entered the public domain. The library models helped secure the public domain. It's also brought access to millions of underserved patrons while directly supporting authors and publishers by purchasing their books. More and more books are being published digitally instead of on paper, and you would think, that would be a blessing. It means maybe in theory books should be even cheaper, because distributing digital assets we know is much cheaper and faster than printing and shipping books. But instead of leveraging these technological advances to increase access and affordability, our big content landlords have just taken advantage of underlying technology to do the exact opposite, to design a big, great artificial subscription paywall around all digital ebooks that raises prices, creates monopolies, just charges non-profit libraries high recurring yearly fees, and just prevents libraries or anyone else really from having the option to buy and actually own the material. Okay, so the future might seem a little bleak, but what about the millions of kind of, past books from the 20th century the libraries already do own that should be kind of coming into the public domain now in the next kind of couple of years? Works that are sometimes, decades old, rich with cultural heritage, less likely to be of financial interest to content landlords. Um, and they're unlikely to ever be released as ebooks. Certainly, libraries can at least take these physical books, which they've already paid for and rightfully own, and make them digitally accessible to at-home learners through secure library best practices, you'd think. It's an idea that several organizations have explored. As our world's needs shift to online, we have increasingly people inhabiting more and more online spaces rather than their kind of physical library equivalent. Organizations like Google and Internet Archive have spent the better part of the decade digitizing their books to make them increasingly findable and accessible, especially for approved print disabled audience who may have no other way to read pre-digital books. Like, consider how like a blind patron can't just buy a textbook from Amazon. A digital accessible version isn't a luxury; it is just a prerequisite to basic usability. But even these gestures seem to have triggered lawsuits which are bent on making libraries irrelevant to the digital age. There's no other way of putting it. We saw in late 2020, at the height of the pandemic, how content landlords decided to sue the Internet Archive, that non-profit digital library, for trying to make the physical books, their library books that they rightfully own, digitally available to patrons by using strictly controlled digital lending library practices. What appears to be at stake here is what rights libraries will lose in order to continue serving the public in the digital age, as book availability options become increasingly regulated by these bad actors. And we've seen elsewhere kind of touchstones here where cultural or corporate interests try to take a really big unpopular position. Like, what I'm saying doesn't sound desirable for any of us as kind of like library and information professionals, as library patrons indeed. We've saw a couple of years ago when corporate interests tried to short GameStop, the market squeezed back. Users kind of rallied together using platforms like Reddit to kind of show that they were not happy with the way things are going and they wanted to fight back. Libraries can't do this. They don't have the budget to compete with content landlords. And secondly, they're sort of caught in this kind of catch-22 where they have an obligation to serve their patrons. Imagine if every library stopped buying book subscriptions for a year. It would only hurt readers and less established authors most, and that's not okay. It means that really the community needs to take action, to vote, to take peacefully and respectfully use their voices to secure a digital future for our library system. One which ensure like a thriving public domain that protects individual book ownership rights, which preserves our cultural heritage for the long term and not just the lease period, and which serves and empowers the most vulnerable among us. It's so important that the wider concepts around openness in the library world is something that we're promoting and embracing. Because at the heart of open source is community. And the idea of bringing power back to people, we really need to rally around that community, be active participants, and provide the foundation for reclaiming ownership. So just final thoughts and kind of a little bit of a call to action. If libraries are to survive and thrive as digital public spaces, it'll take more than librarians. It'll take people stepping up, bringing skills to non-profits. No, I'm talking to like a highly skilled audience here. It'll take organisers, help them to facilitate new types of collaboration between librarians and the people that they serve in an open and supportive environment. It'll take visionary digital urban planners, if we want to start kind of imagining these types of virtual roles, to transpose these kind of palaces for the people. Again, we have kind of these beautiful libraries as cornerstones of our communities in kind of towns and cities. And again, it's just a matter of transposing that virtual. Libraries should be at the centre of that vision, providing ready and open access to empower communities and to serve public goods. So I appreciate I'm a little bit over, but if there's any kind of, like I say, because it's more of a kind of philosophical, discursive wee slant and things that I've been talking about maybe today, rather than going more into kind of Perl and Koha things. If there's any questions or anything, or any thoughts, I'd be happy to kind of talk a little bit more.
I don't see any hands in the audience right now. I'm Esbekka from the National Library of Finland. I could comment that it's so different with the big players. I mean, you can't negotiate with Netflix. However, nationally, we have a much better relations with the publishing world, and we can. Sorry about that. So what I was saying that play, as we always say, Finland is a small country. Everybody knows each other. So the relationships between, for example, libraries and publishers are a whole different story from the global market. So it can be done, and I think the publishers would even Finland do what is profitable. So it may just need a little bit of a change of mind and change of your mindsets to be able to even provide, for example, access to your literature better than the subscription programs at the moment do. So it's not an futile fight if you want to go to fight about that, but there are constructive ways to go forward.
Yeah, I think you're so right. It's very much kind of like what underlies why it works so well is that more kind of like close-knit community setup that you have, and it's a matter of kind of having that being inherent, having it being very present within our library systems, with that kind of open source technological foundation that really puts community at the center, and just having that be at the core, building outwards from there in terms of our whole kind of thinking and approach.
Okay, so we are over time and I don't see any hands up. So thank you very much. And here we will go to the coffee break. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks ever so much.